So welcome to the working group on the economic dimension of a sustainable and circular bioeconomy. Maria from the FAO and myself, Henrik Beermann from the German Fraunhofer Society, will be facilitating this session. In this breakout discussion, we aim to showcase how the economic dimension of sustainability is addressed in the bioeconomy strategy or initiatives of Thailand, the Amazonia state of Brazil, Germany, and Namibia. We focus particularly on the role of technological, market, and human resource context in promoting structural economic change. The agenda of this breakout session is divided into two main parts. Firstly, we will hear from our four panelists from 4 different continents on some lessons learned on their bioeconomy strategies. And secondly, we will open a Q&A session, a question and answer session, to hear from our audience. We invite you to post your questions in the chat and please indicate to which panelist your question relates to. Having said that, I would hand over now to my colleague Maria from the FAO. Thank you.
Thank you, Henrik. Can you hear me all well? Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. So, as it was said in the opening, the set of aspirational principles and criteria for a sustainable bioeconomy is the thread of our discussion today. These principles and criteria have been agreed by more than 35 representatives from governments, private sector, civil society, and research institutions who take part of the FAO-led community of practice in bioeconomy. This panel debate is framed under the principles and criteria that tackle the economic dimension of sustainability. So as you will see in the chat box in a couple of minutes, each principle entails different criteria. So these principles and criteria emphasize that a sustainable bioeconomy should promote inclusive economic growth and economic development, and by this means contribute to leave no one behind. Leaving no one behind is particularly important when discussing a paradigm shift. So Jana, if you could please share the principles and criteria so the participants can follow them. Thanks a lot. So these principles acknowledge the role that bioeconomy can play in local development, for instance, by diversifying rural economies. Bioeconomy focuses on the promotion of innovation and knowledge generation, and at the same time, existing traditional knowledge and proven technologies should be fostered. Also, bioeconomy is closely related to market development at national and international level, and a sustainable bioeconomy should promote sustainable trade and market practices. And this should expand the opportunities of local communities and reduce the risk at the same time. So let me now introduce the panelists to you. First of all, I will start introducing Dr. Sakarinder Womiratana from Thailand. It is a pleasure to have you here. He has quite an impressive bio, and just to summarize and just to mention some of the roles that he's currently undertaking, let me tell you that he is the chairman of the National Center for Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology of the National Science and Technology Development Agency. He's also chairman of the Thai Academy of Science and Technology Foundation, also a member of the National Economic and Social Development Council, just to mention some. It is a pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Womiratana. You're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon.
We will go to the questions just in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Okay, I will introduce the other participants now, and then
thank you.
We'll go there. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Now, let me introduce Tatiana Shore. She is Executive Secretary of Science, Technology, and Innovation of Amazonas State, Brazil. She's a professor at the Geography Department at the Federal University of Amazonas, and the main research interest area for her is economic, food, urban geographies, urban sustainability, natural resources, and territorial planning. She has done extensive fieldwork in market structure for food and alimentary transition in the Amazon. Thank you, Tatiana, for joining today. I don't see her. I don't know if we lost Tatiana. It seems so. Well, we will try to send the link to her now, ask for her to join to the plenary. I will now introduce Gerd Unkelbach. He joined the Fraunhofer Society in 2005, and he contributed to the development of the Fraunhofer Center for Chemical Biotechnological Processes, CBP, whose leadership he has taken in 2012. The CBP is an open access platform for developing and scaling up new biorefinery processes. He is involved in several national bioeconomy committees and working groups, like the board of directors of the Bioeconomy Cluster, the Saxon Academy of Science and Humanities, and is a member of the section Industrial Use of Renewable Raw Materials of the Society for Chemical Engineering and Biotechnology. Welcome to our panel, Gerd.
Also welcome from my side. Thanks.
Great. And finally, let me introduce Paulus Mungei. He is the biotechnology manager at the National Commission on Research, Science and Technology, Namibia. Mr. Mungei represents this National Commission, which is a government agency under the Ministry of Higher Education, Technology and Innovation, and it is leading the agenda toward the development of the Sustainable Bioeconomy Strategy in Namibia. Mr. Mungei has been coordinating the national stakeholders in the bioeconomy sector to establish the national priority areas towards socioeconomic advancement. He's a member of the ad hoc International Advisory Council to the Global Bioeconomy Summit and a member of the Food and Agriculture Organization International Sustainable Bioeconomy Working Group. And it's a pleasure for us to have you here, Paulus. Thanks for joining us. Now back to you, Henrik.
What is happening now is a panel discussion. Before addressing a question to each panelist, we will briefly introduce the key highlights from the respective bioeconomy strategies that the countries or states, in case of the Amazonia state of Brazil, are working on. And I will start with the introduction of the Thai case. We will have the introduction, the question and the answer of the question. In total will have 5 minutes each. So I will quickly introduce the strategy and raise the question. So in Thailand, a new model called BCG has been conceptualized to drive the economic and social development. BCG is the integration of bioeconomy development for B, circular economy development for C, and green economy development. This approach intends to shift the policy focus away from the key goal to produce wealth and modernization to sustainability and security. The approach aims to use science and technology to transform Thailand to a knowledge-based economy and is focusing on 4 focal industries: food and agriculture, the medical and wellness sector, energy and biomaterials, and tourism and the creative industry. Thailand is undertaking several actions to promote the transition to a bio-based economy. That is promoting human resource development, for instance, by promoting researcher mobility schemes, strengthening the national R&D system by involving, for instance, the National Science and Technology Development Agency in this process, and universities. Thailand is setting up new infrastructures, such as establishing science parks, or establishing special economic zones, such as the Eastern Economic Corridor. Thailand provides soft side support. Startups are supported by voucher programs, for instance, and innovation assistance programs are in place. And Thailand has tax incentives for bio-based development. So Thailand has made meaningful efforts to foster the transition to a bioeconomy. And the country strategy focuses very much on R&D, capacity building, and tech transfer. Against this backdrop, Mr. Bumiratana, which policy tools has the country put in place to develop the bioeconomy and achieve inclusive growth at the same time?
Thank you. Thank you, Henrik, and good hello to everyone who joined this session. I'd like to just briefly introduce how Thailand has gone through what we call a reform process. We are now trying very hard to drive bioeconomy as part of the BCG growth engine, the bioeconomy, the biotechnology, the circular and the green growth engine. We has been carrying out this over the last 6 years through a major reform process. The aim is, of course, to threefold. Firstly, to move Thailand out of the middle income trap, for which we have been stuck in this middle income trap for the past 3 decades or so. So we need to drive productivity and competitiveness. Secondly, we like to reduce the various society gaps, which call for inclusive development. And thirdly, we like to achieve greener ecosystem, greener ecological environment for longer term sustainability and for our future generations. The reform process has led us to, for the past year and a half, combining of the previous Ministry of Science and Technology together with the higher education part of the Ministry of Education. And to that, add 2 major research organizations, the National Research Council of Thailand and the Thailand Research Foundations. All these now come under the Ministry of Higher Education, Science, Research and Innovation. This new ministry is responsible to develop talent and skills manpower and strengthen our STI and research infrastructure. The plan is to build internal strength, building adequate infrastructure for research development and innovation, and a strong innovation and entrepreneurship ecosystem. The ministry will be the core in driving the BCG in action for our new sustainable growth engine. The focus sectors, as mentioned by Henrik, are 4 sectors. I won't mention that again. But our intention is to use our beloved late King Rama IX sufficiency economy philosophy as the main decision-making framework guidelines, which will ensure a balanced growth based on our adequate internal strength. In short, three interrelated components and 2 underlying conditions are central to this sufficiency economy philosophy application. The 3 components are reasonableness, or middle of the path, moderation, and prudence. 2 essential underlying conditions are knowledge and morality. In contrast to the concept to maximize profits for the benefit of some individuals, sufficiency economy philosophy emphasizes maximizing the interests of all stakeholders and having a greater focus on a long-term profitability as opposed to short-term success. In other words, we are concentrated in the triple bottom lines rather than just financial gain as the main motive. With this concept, technology localization will also be an important part in building our adequate internal strength. The government has pushed to try to shift our paradigm from government-led to private sector-led, so PPP, public-private partnerships are the key to this BCG development, and staying away from just government spending to government investment. Many major investments are being put forward to strengthen our infrastructure. The research are now within block grants covering all supply chains for innovation. We also shifting the working in silo in the past into working in synergy to go forward together. So we have set up Eastern Economic Corridor of Innovation. We have EECI, which is this Economic Corridor Innovation, set up Biopolis as a link from lab to commercialization, set up National Biopharmaceutical Facility, and 2 main pilot plants for non-GMP and GMP facility development in those areas. So, and also infrastructure like biobank to utilize our rich biodiversity. Biobank carried out long-term conservation and utilization of Thai bioresources, creating data system for genomes of all these bioresources, and also National Omics Center. So we are looking towards these infrastructures and working with the major partners in the private and collaborating with international players to increase investment in Thailand, and at the same time trying very hard to build up innovation in the communities around in the rural areas, for which it will be the key for bio-based development, and hopefully we will achieve social closing the gaps in the society, for which we see as the major and first priority, then move on to improve productivities and competitiveness for our getting out of the middle income trap. So these are the things that we have been carried out, and I hope we will share the documents with the participants later on when we have the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for this very, very insightful, interesting, and distinct approach to promoting bio-based development in Thailand. As I said, if the audience has questions or comments to this presentation, please raise these questions in the chat. It indicates that the question relates to Mr. Bumiratana. As the next, I would introduce the German case. Well, as we heard, the bioeconomy relies on the production and transformation of biomass and biological resources. While bio-innovations are likely to provide many opportunities for economic growth and the environment, there may be risks and hidden environmental costs. Along the German Bioeconomy Strategy, the Fraunhofer Society, as a huge R&D organization, pursues the following goals: strengthening the bioeconomy by building up value chains and networks, for instance, by developing new integrative business models for raw material suppliers, converters, and product distributors, and the integration of new processes for the conversion of biogenic raw materials into existing chemical value chains based on biorefinery technologies, as defined in the German biorefinery roadmap. Against this backdrop, Mr. Unkelbach, how can advanced technology lead to structural economic change and help to deal with environmental risks simultaneously? Could you please share some concrete examples from your work? Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, Henrik, for the introduction. And yeah, of course, I will try within this very short 5 minutes to give you some insights into our activities to speed up circular bioeconomy in Germany, and also especially in some regions in Germany. So if we are talking about bioeconomic processes for the production of high-value chemicals and materials, we are aiming for the structural change of an existing industry, because the chemical industry, for example, is a very efficient and integrated industry network. And to be economically attractive, the processes themselves and the corresponding value chains has to be competitive with this existing industry. So therefore, the new products coming from biomass should offer additional benefits, like, for example, biodegradability. That makes it easier to start up, of course, economic activities. Because nowadays, environmental benefits are not valued in the same way as with economic figures. But I am sure that this is going to change in the next years. Think on CO2 taxes, for example, increasing the benefit for so-called first movers in bioeconomy. Anyhow, the new value chains, starting with renewables, have to be more environmental friendly than existing ones. With these targets in mind, there are many opportunities for different partners involved, and this internationally, as the new value chains and networks are within a global business. You always need a raw material provider, a technology provider, sometimes an additional engineering company, a converter, an investor, and a product formulator and distributor. So these are all partners involved in a very long value chain. And in respect to biomass, you have to manage this chain differently compared to classical fossil-based production processes, as most of the biomass is not stable enough to transport it via long distances. Therefore, new bioeconomic processes needs more decentralized approaches. So as we heard this in the first talk, for example. Please think also on bioplastics produced from agricultural residues, which giving opportunities for countries with high biomass production. The technology provider plays also an important role beyond the process itself. He has to overlook the whole value chain to avoid, for example, environmental risks. This is done via a complete LCA, taking all these circular economy aspects into account. In Germany, for example, as it is a small country and we are importing most of our feedstocks, Germany could act as such a technology provider. To establish a knowledge-based bioeconomy, a lot of R&D activity is supported up to pilot and demonstration scale, like the Fraunhofer CBP. This is in accordance with the Principle 7, which you can also read in the chat. This includes, of course, also new and necessary biomass pre-treatment and conversion techniques, like with new processes in the industrial biotechnology. I hope you can see with this very small example that partnerships are essential to implement a bioeconomy. To support finding the right local ones, national and international networks and clusters are formed in the past. A very good example, in my opinion, is the German bioeconomy cluster, being mostly active in Middle and East Germany. Founded via a governmental program with the aim to link forestry and the chemical industry, new value chains have been created. Within the network, underutilized wood species was identified, and partners are now working on their usage, having the positive environmental effect that the forestry is now replanting more hardwood species in mixed forests, which are healthier and much more environmental friendly than monocultures. Especially in some regions in Germany where mostly coal is used for energy production, the pressure on a structural change is high, as there is a political decision to step out the coal-fired power generation. Here, a link between the energy sector and the sustainable production of chemicals and materials is necessary. this regional restructuring process, which is politically and socially supported, is supported, for example, by the leading market initiatives of the state Saxony-Anhalt. And this offers additional opportunities for local cooperation, as, for example, mentioned in Principle 3, you can read in the chat. I hope you see that new bioeconomy processes can combine economic and environmental benefits. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Gerd. At this point, I would hand over to Maria, who introduces two more strategies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerd. Thank you for sharing with us the perspective from Fraunhofer, and thank you also, Henrik. Let me kindly remind you to please mute yourself so the discussion can go as smoothly as possible. And please let me encourage you to participate in our chat box. Let's make this session as interactive as possible. So this virtual session poses additional challenges for that, but please let's use the chats. We would like to hear from you, your opinions, your comments. So you're all welcome to that. Well, so now we're going to the case of Namibia. And the National Bioeconomy Strategy in Namibia towards a sustainable economy for the period 2021-2026 will set the scene for implementing national programs and initiatives that will facilitate and support bio-innovations in agriculture, health, environment, indigenous knowledge, and related sectors. A special focus is put on infrastructure development, technology transfer, and human capital development towards Namibia's socioeconomic advancement. The key areas of action are improving agricultural production systems that are circular, prioritize food security and nutrition through minimizing food waste and loss, creation of viable and sustainable value chains of bioproducts emanating from indigenous knowledge as a source of income for rural communities, and the promotion of research and development and innovation in production of bioproducts and services in a sustainable manner that reduces greenhouse gases emissions and contributes to national climate goals. So as we heard, innovation is at the core of bioeconomy. So knowledge exchange and technology transfer have a leading role in accelerating the transition. But at the same time, traditional knowledge and practices have proved to be extremely valuable. So our question for you, Paulus, is how can technology transfer and local traditional knowledge together create synergies or help dealing with the trade-offs in sustainability while also contributing to the paradigm shift? The floor is yours, Paulus.
Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone, participants. It's a pleasure being here. And thank you for the question. I think you can agree with me that the interaction between indigenous knowledge holders and users continue to be susceptible with undesirable outcomes, such as misappropriation and socio-economic inequalities. Back here in Namibia, the majority of the Namibian population lives in rural areas, which depend directly on agriculture for food security and income generation, with a strong practice on indigenous knowledge. As a nation, the nation has since realized that indigenous knowledge play a crucial role in the process of economic development, improvement of social cohesiveness, creating of employment, and eradicating poverty and hunger for national prosperity, because that's part of the national development priorities. Indigenous knowledge is a ready and valuable resource for sustainable and resilient livelihood, which embraces the use of plants, water, animal products for the treatment of diseases, and also as a source of food. And it attracts increasing public interest due to its several applications: bioeconomy, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, and food preparation, especially from the African communities. Well, as a part of, apart from the country, Namibia has drafted the indigenous knowledge system policy, but our vision to build a sustainable bioeconomy, Namibia has decided to focus on 5 strategy focus areas. Of these, 2 of them includes agriculture bioeconomy, indigenous knowledge, healthy economy. And we believe that with these focus areas, the priority include creation of variable, sustainable value chain of bioproducts emanating from indigenous knowledge as a source of income for rural communities, and also promoting innovative indigenous products and a service for sustainable agricultural food systems for better nutrition and health in communal areas. And we know that this is also aligned with the key principles that have been mentioned earlier. Now, answering part of the question is that technology transfer help, is an inconvenience through that technology transfer help early product development or services. Such platform rarely exists in Namibia at the moment. And I heard from the initial discussion in the morning time that this is what low technology is required, for example, from the developing countries, and Namibia is not exemption from that. And hence the establishment of the technology transfer fostering platform will help address this gap between knowledge holders. The position of innovation fostering platform achieved through a provision of technical oriented service to researchers, to SMEs, and to different community. And this will allow everyone in a value chain to be competent in the related bioeconomy sector. And this includes providing also latest technological information. And this idea of platforms, fostering platform, will increase the chance of every Namibia to have equal access to innovation and technology information. And we know that indigenous knowledge is a dynamic and is constantly influenced by both internal and external factors. That's why from the pre-meetings that we had with stakeholders, there is a strong recommendation from bioeconomy sectors, which include the management of traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge for sustainable development, of which communities should be placed with the knowledge creation setting that continuous creation. And also there should be a development and promotion of product for commercialization, because we realize that different products within, they'll never go out from the initial product development, and to make the matter worse, it will not even make it for commercialization, leading to food losses. And also we realized that some of the recommendation was that traditional knowledge systems or there's a need for infrastructure to nurture bioinnovation, and there's an immense pool of traditional knowledge in Namibia. Another one is also for capacity building implementation. There should be a capacity building, a bottom-up approach, of which the knowledge system should be trained or be so that they will be aware of how they can foster using tech stations, although there's an urgent need. So Namibia Bioeconomy Strategy will be developed by multi-sectoral teams, which include different institutions, policymakers, private industries, and traditional knowledge practices, keeping also in mind the possible upcoming intellectual property rights of communities. And obviously, with the current COVID impact, the development of bioeconomy strategy and implementation is a great opportunity, not only in Namibia, but I believe it globally. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Paulus. It's always interesting to hear from the perspective of Namibia and these particular futures. So now we will go to the case of Amazonia. Now we have Tatiana with us. So welcome, Tatiana. Let me briefly introduce the work that the Amazonia is undertaking right now, and then we'll hear from her. They are working on the strategic planning of bioeconomy and circular bioeconomy, public policies in the Amazon state in different scales. This strategic planning includes actions that strengthen science and technology, territorial planning, conservation and protection of traditional populations. So special emphasis on the industrial policy and food sovereignty is put in this work. The region of Amazonia in Brazil is home to one of the most unique biomes. Biological resources, traditional knowledge, and local communities shape the development pathways of the region. So let me ask you, Tatiana, how do you envision the integration of science and technology with these unique features and attributes of the Amazonia? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Maria Eugenia. It's a good Amazonian. I got lost in all the workshops and panels, but it was great because they're very interesting talks, and every new panel I was like, wow, this is very interesting. So I found myself and it's very, very important for me to just give you just a couple of feedbacks before I really get into the talk. So I'm going to talk about the bioeconomy strategy for Amazonas state, which is not Amazonia. Sometimes when people get this very much mixed up, I'm not talking about Brazil, but I'm talking on a subnational level. And Amazonas state is very interesting. That's where I work. And it's 90% of it is still covered in forest, in native forest. There's a very big, diverse ethnical groups, including around 23 isolated indigenous groups. So we're talking about a very specific context in terms of biodiversity and social diversity. And at the same time, it's extremely urbanized. So we have around like 70–80% of all the population living in cities. Manaus, which is the capital of the state, has 2,200,000 people. So it is a big city. And since the 60s, the 1967, we have in a national level, industrial policy in Amazonas state, in Manaus. So we have 53 years of industrialization in Manaus. So we're talking about like these two different aspects. So we have the competitive aspect of the biome, the biodiversity of the forest, the traditional people, the indigenous people, and the riverine people. At the same time, we are a very important industrial pole. So we're basically the only producers of motorcycles in the whole of South America. This industrial pole does not talk to the forest. So that's the first challenge. How do we make these two things talk? How can we understand bioeconomy or circular bioeconomy or any type of circular economy that doesn't exist here that will help us make these two things talk? Because we cannot proceed from an industrial policy when we're talking about bioeconomy with innovation and science and technology incorporated in it. So this is very, very important when we start talking. Brazil, differently from what we're doing in Amazonas, Brazil relates a lot of bioeconomy to innovation in agriculture. We're very strong in innovation for soybeans and corn and all these commodities. What we're doing in Amazonas state, we're trying to think about bioeconomy in a different framework. So we're building a narrative. So it is really a narrative, which is very, very important to have in this moment in time and politically in Brazil. So we're building a narrative where we have like three different scales of bioeconomy. To start with like a traditional interpretation of bioeconomy, where we're based mainly on the extractivism and small agricultural, traditional populations, very low anthropolization of the aspects, very low production, very resilient to climate change, very conservation of the biome. So that's like one scale. The middle scale, as we talk about it, it's more around the forest products. It's a bit higher in scale. It's related into production of native forests, which is also like important in terms of impact to the forest. It's not very much impacting, but it does some impact already. And the third scale is more like a commodity type of production in bioeconomy. And we've been trying to build strategies and public policies in these three scales. We understand that when we start talking about public policies for bioeconomy and circular bioeconomy, we have like this big jigsaw puzzles, and we have to start building the pieces. And we've been working a lot on the quintuple Alice. So all we do, all discussion in public policies, we always have the different sectors of societies involved, different sectors of the government involved, different sectors of the investment banks involved, the private sector involved, and very important, academia. Because we understand that bioeconomy is not selling the product in itself without aggregation of value and without aggregation of technology. So we've been doing lots of actions in this aspect, considering the three different scales and considering the resilience of the population, considering that when we're talking about bioeconomy in a state like Amazonas, where 50% of the population before the COVID pandemic lived below poverty level, not that the other 50% lived better off. So we do have to think about a development in terms of equity and a democratic development where everybody has a voice. But we also have to think about the attraction of a private sector and industrial sector so that it can really be an important economic driver for the state. I'm going to talk about just two initiatives, which I think answers the question. Last week, we launched a Rainforest Social Business School, which is in the State University. Is a school, it's a digital school where we're trying to attract young people that have good ideas of how to aggregate science technology into forest products, especially those that live in the interior of Amazonas, because Amazonas state is very much divided into the capital, which concentrates 50% of the population, and the interior of the Amazon. It's also important to note that we're a basically fluvial state. We have only 2 or 3 roads. So we're not linked to the rest of the countries through roads. So the dimensions of Amazonia are enormous. So so everything we do, we have to think about the logistics. That's one very important aspect we did. And the other public policy which we launched this year, we're building a scientific and technological park in the frontier with Peru and Colombia. For the idea of the dimension from Manaus to this park, it's 5 days in a boat. So it's very far away. And in this park, what we're trying to do, we have 3 universities settled there. We have 50 PhDs already living there. It's a very active, a very important area. It's a frontier area in Brazil. So we're investing in their labs so that they can help local community to get certified and get their better production of their extractivist products. Because if we want to reach bioeconomy and better markets, more equitable, better, we have to be able to certify our products. And the last example I'm going to give, so Brazil nuts. We're the biggest producers of Brazil nut in Brazil. We don't have one lab in our whole state, which is enormous. I don't know how many Europes inside of it, where we can certify Brazil nut for aflatoxin, which is a toxin. So we can't export to the US or anywhere else. So there's like this basic infrastructure we have to deal with so that the bioeconomy can in fact have an impact in the local population, in the economic dynamic, and become a public industrial policy maybe in the future. So that's a bit of it. Thank you, Maria Eugenia.
All right, thanks a lot. The next step in our agenda is our Q&A session, and we were collecting questions. In fact, we received one question from the audience that I would like to share, and that question relates to what Paulus told us. So I would just read this question and then ask you, Paulus, to respond to that. Are you using academic researchers to assess indigenous knowledge in the community, or are you using a framework to codify the links between indigenous knowledge and modern industrial practices? For instance, indigenous knowledge on biofermentation.
Hi, thank you for the question. Briaman, I was just typing to answer the question, but fortunately you asked. I have to answer that and I have to stop typing. I think actually both, what we have been doing. I have to stress that indigenous knowledge is one of the foreseen key thematic area in the bioeconomy strategy. Initially, researchers have been documenting, for example, indigenous knowledge system activities in a country. However, it was very skeptical to some rural communities, especially the knowledge holders, in a sense that remember that we are working with rural communities, and from rural communities, at most times, policymakers, for example, or researchers goes to these communities, get information, and then they don't, for example, bring them back. And they will still go back to those communities only for specific needs. And they have been skeptical, for example, on things like knowledge holder, intellectual property rights that are strongly coming up. And that's why after that, certain information have been documented by researchers. I think communities through local authorities have raised this up with the government and realized that it's very important to have a formulated policy. And that's why the government of Namibia at the moment have drafted an indigenous knowledge system policy, just to have a formulated, a harmonized and formulated policy to avoid some of those to avoid and keep everyone up in case of intellectual properties, in case of knowledge holders, and also information, things associated with bioprospectings. That is also part of respecting the Nagoya Kuala Lumpur Protocol. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for this answer, Paulus. Well, we still have a bit of time for a couple of more questions, but we also prepared for one question in case everything is clarified here. So if no further questions are raised, then I would raise a question to the speakers. And that question relates to this principle 8, sustainable bioeconomy should use and promote sustainable trade and market practices. My question is, how does the transition towards a sustainable bioeconomy change the roles in global trade and markets? And which are the challenges that countries and regions face in international integration? And I would like to ask the speakers, one of the speakers, to give an answer to this question from their perspective.
I can start if the other speakers don't want to.
Please.
I think it's a very important question, especially if we consider the knowledge we have now of how trade is done in the area. So specifically for Amazonia state, what we have is a very big asymmetry of information. So we are never really sure of what is happening on the floor of the forest. And it is traditionally very much dependent on the intermediaries, which it's not like simple intermediaries. They're very much, there's like this social violence in the trade of the forest products and dependence of these intermediaries in the worst forms possible. So what we've been trying to do so that we can access better markets and bring new buyers into the system, we're trying to diminish the asymmetry of information and make it possible for new actors to understand how these value chains work. Because one of the difficulties we have is that when we bring new business people who are willing to buy better trade-offs and who are willing to buy equitably in the forest products directly from the local population, the indigenous populations, they don't understand how it works because the market structures are very asymmetrical. So we're trying to build some asymmetry throughout the value chain so that we can in fact protect local populations when we start getting into new markets, because that's the big challenge when we're talking about bioeconomy with traditional indigenous populations.
If I can perhaps add to that.
Yes, please.
I think from the developing perspective, we realize that different countries have different strengths, especially for some countries, for example, have specializations in different tech stations. But when, for example, rural communities are coming up with different products, principle of uniformity, principle of standards, and principle of reliability are really key importance, especially from the raw material supply side of biotrade value chain. I believe that really there's a point of, for example, at the point of product retail, companies in different platforms, they need to be who wants to export their products need to ensure really international competitiveness. And I believe that they will only be able to do this through a provision of quality standard techniques and know-how. And they will only be, if that is exposed to them, they will be able to trade on at a certain, to put their products that is very competitive. And the second one is also, there's a challenge of accessibility to research and development platforms. And in my talk, 5-minute talk earlier, I think there's an urgent need, not high tech, but we can start with low tech stations that will require, for example, communities, to see how do they produce their products. We have realized that there's massive food losses, and this has been documented from our perspective. And should these countries share different techniques at the same level, they will be able to have a certain technological competitiveness at the global level. And this will only be able to realize the global trade and marketing. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I directly step into that and just a short comment. I fully agree on the statements, and I think we also need adaptable processes because the value chains are very long always if we are talking about material or chemical products from biomass. And yeah, dealing with this debate on food first and then chemical and material production, there is a good opportunity, as I mentioned, for the different partners and the different roles within these value chains. So we need more robust and dedicated processes, and therefore we need the knowledge, and therefore R&D is very good to support and build up these value chains on an international basis and also exchange this know-how on the new processes.
May I add on to that?
Please.
Just from the point of view of Thailand, for which we have so many small farmers in the country, I think the challenge is how to create value at a good value for small farmers. Generally, when you talk about these value chains, small farmers are the one that get hurt because if you produce produce raw materials for conversion into other values, long value chains. It's hard to get the values back to the first producer. So the challenge is to create high value products, high value horticultures, high values products, and at the same time create ways of getting the products to the consumers directly rather than through the commercial value chains. That's one, and I think the online market does help, but at the same time, you need to come up with a very ingenious way of creating high value products from small farmer side. So, and also another way is to try to create groups of communities, local value added productions together. All these are very challenging to small farmers in communities and in the rural areas. I wish there's solutions to that, but I don't really see unless you create a way of returning top value back to the producer equitably and fairly. It's I think it's a big challenge once you have small farmers in productions. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for these answers. We just received the message from the organizing team that we are that we have reached the time to go back to the main room. Well, having said that, I would like to thank you for your active engagement in this debate. And of course, a special thanks to our panelists, Sakandir Bumiratana, Tatjana Schor, Paulus Mongei, and Gerd Unkelbach. Well, the discussion continues during the plenary session. We will hear a summary of what has been discussed in all of the 4 breakout groups. We were focusing on the economic dimension of sustainable bioeconomy development. The other 3 were focusing on the I think that's a clear message that we should go back. So see you in the main room.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.